The humidity clung to Dr. Elena Morrison's skin as she stepped out of her car into the parking lot of the Telfair Museum's Conservation Lab. August in Savannah, Georgia, was unforgiving. She gathered her portfolio and made her way toward the unmarked building on the outskirts of the historic district. At 42, Elena had spent 2 decades restoring damaged artwork. Her reputation preceded her, which was why the Telfair had called her for this project. An 1847 portrait, 7 sisters, important to local history. The urgency in the curator's voice had been unmistakable. The conservation lab was a converted warehouse. Elena swiped her temporary access card and stepped into the frigid air conditioning, her glasses fogging instantly. Sarah Chen, the museum's head curator, appeared from behind a partition. At 35, Sarah had made a name for herself, uncovering lost pieces of Southern history, particularly those related to women whose stories had been erased or forgotten. "Dr. Morrison, thank you for coming on such short notice," Sarah said, extending her hand. "Please call me Elena. Your message said this was urgent." Sarah's dark eyes flickered toward a door at the back of the lab. "I need you to see it first, then we'll talk." They walked through the main conservation area, past workstations where other restorers hunched over canvases. The air smelled of linseed oil and chemical solvents. The back room was smaller, windowless. In the center, illuminated by carefully positioned LED lights, stood an easel holding a portrait roughly 4 feet by 5 feet. Even beneath layers of yellowed varnish and accumulated grime, Elena could make out 7 female figures arranged in a formal composition. She approached slowly, her trained eye already cataloguing the damage. Craquelure patterns spiderwebbed across the surface. The canvas showed signs of past water damage in the lower right corner. But it was the faces that held her attention. 7 young women, ranging in age from perhaps 12 to mid-20s, all with the same distinctive features. High cheekbones, intelligent eyes, mouths set in expressions that could have been serenity or resignation. "The Whitmore sisters," Sarah said quietly behind her, "painted in the spring of 1847 by an itinerant artist named Marcus Webb. They were the daughters of Edmund Whitmore, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Chatham County." Eleanor leaned closer, examining the brushwork. Webb was talented. The technique is sophisticated for a traveling painter. "He disappeared 3 months after completing this portrait." Something in Sarah's tone made Eleanor turn. "Disappeared?" "Vanished. His belongings were found in his rented room at a boarding house on Bull Street. His paints, his other canvases, everything except the clothes he was wearing. The landlady said he went out one morning and never came back." Sarah pulled a folder from under her arm, opening it to reveal photocopies of old newspaper clippings. But that's not the strangest part. Elena took the folder, her fingers brushing against the brittle copies. The Savannah Republican, dated October 1847. "Local artist vanishes without trace." She scanned the article, then flipped to the next clipping. November 1847. "Whitmore daughters missing." Her stomach tightened. "All 7?" she asked. "Within 6 weeks of the portrait's completion, one by one. The youngest first, then the next oldest, and so on. By December of 1847, all 7 were gone. No bodies were ever found, no ransom demands. Edmund Whitmore died in 1849, a broken man. The plantation was sold off piece by piece to settle debts." Elena returned to the portrait, studying those faces with new intensity. 7 sisters who had sat for this painting, probably excited about having their likenesses captured. 7 young women who had walked the streets of Savannah, attended parties, had dreams and desires and futures ahead of them. And then, nothing. The portrait ended up in storage in the late 1920s, Sarah continued. It was only recently rediscovered during an inventory of the museum's collection. When I started researching its provenance, I found something that made me think we needed to restore it immediately. She produced another document, this one more recent, a handwritten letter, the paper cream-colored and expensive. This was tucked into the back of the frame. It's dated 1920, written by a woman named Constance Whitmore Ayres. She was Edmund Whitmore's great-granddaughter. Eleanor read aloud. To whomever finds this portrait, my family has kept silent for too long. What happened to the 7 sisters was not an act of God, nor random misfortune. They were silenced because they dared to speak. I do not have the courage they possessed, but I can ensure their faces are not forgotten. The truth is hidden in their eyes. Signed, Constance Whitmore Ayres. The room felt colder suddenly, despite the carefully regulated temperature. Elena's professional instincts warred with an unexpected unease in her chest. The truth is hidden in their eyes, she repeated. What does that mean? I was hoping the restoration process might reveal something, Sarah said. Modern imaging techniques can see beneath layers of paint and varnish that were invisible when this was created. If there's something hidden in the portrait, we'll find it. Elena circled the easel, examining the portrait from different angles. The composition was traditional, the 7 sisters arranged in a pyramid formation with the oldest in the center. They wore their finest dresses, dark fabrics with white lace collars that were typical of the period. But there was something in their expressions that bothered her. They weren't smiling exactly, but neither did they look somber. It was as if they were waiting for something. I'll need to do a full analysis before we begin any actual restoration, Elena said, slipping into her professional mode. X-ray fluorescence, infrared reflectography, ultraviolet examination. It'll take at least a week just for the preliminary work. Take whatever time you need. I've cleared the schedule. This project has priority. Sarah hesitated, then added, There's one more thing. I've been having these dreams since we brought the portrait out of storage. Eleanor turned sharply. Dreams? I see them walking through Savannah at night, the 7 sisters. They're looking for something or someone. They don't speak, they just walk, but I can feel their desperation. Sarah laughed, but it sounded forced. I know how that sounds. I'm a rational person, Dr. Morrison. I don't believe in ghosts, but the dreams are so vivid and they happen every night now. Have you told anyone else? God, no. They'd think I was losing my mind. Aggie, Sarah met Elena's eyes. I'm telling you because I need someone else to see what I'm seeing. I need to know if I'm imagining things, or if there really is something wrong with this portrait. Elena looked back at the 7 faces staring out from their prison of darkened varnish and time. 7 young women who had been erased from history, reduced to a footnote in old newspapers. The rational part of her brain said this was just another restoration job, albeit with an interesting provenance. But another part, the part that had spent years studying the work of human hands and learning to read the emotions artists poured into their creations, whispered that Sarah was right to be concerned. I'll start tomorrow, Elena said. But I want access to everything you have on the Whitmore family and the painter. Letters, diaries, property records, anything that might give us context. Already compiled. Sarah handed her a flash drive. I've been researching this for months. There are some interesting patterns, but I wanted to wait until we had the portrait properly examined before drawing any conclusions. They left the back room together, and Elena was grateful to be away from those watching eyes. The main lab suddenly felt warmer, more alive. She made arrangements with Sarah for the next day's work, discussing equipment needs and timeline expectations. But her mind was already elsewhere, already puzzling over the mystery of 7 sisters who had simply ceased to exist. As she drove home through Savannah's historic district, Elena couldn't help but notice the city differently. The grand antebellum homes with their wrought iron balconies and Spanish moss-draped oaks had always seemed romantic to her, but now she saw them as monuments to a darker history. How many people had lived and died within those walls? How many secrets had been buried beneath manicured gardens and polite society? Her apartment was in a converted townhouse on Jones Street, one of the few remaining residential areas that hadn't been entirely taken over by tourists and bed and breakfasts. She climbed the stairs to her second-floor unit, the old wood creaking under her feet in familiar patterns. Inside, she poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto her couch with her laptop. The folder contained hundreds of scanned documents organized by date. She started with the newspaper articles. The pattern was strange. Each sister had vanished from a different location. The youngest, Mary, aged 12, had disappeared while walking home from a music lesson. Her teacher said she'd left the house just after 3 in the afternoon. Her parents' home was only 4 blocks away. She never arrived. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, nothing. 3 days later, Catherine, aged 14, vanished from her own bedroom during the night. The family maid had seen her go upstairs at 9 o'clock. When her mother went to wake her the next morning, the room was empty. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The disappearances continued, each more baffling than the last. Elizabeth, aged 17, vanished from a crowded church service. One moment she was in her pew, the next she was simply gone. Margaret, 19, disappeared from a carriage while travelling to visit friends in the countryside. The driver stopped to water the horses, and when he opened the door to help her down, the carriage was empty. By the time the eldest, Anne, aged 24, went missing, the entire city was in a panic. Savannah in 1847 was a bustling port city of 15,000 people, but it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. 7 daughters from one of the most prominent families vanishing without a trace was unprecedented, terrifying. The theories had been wild and varied: abduction by pirates, revenge by a rival family, divine judgment for sins unspecified. But no evidence ever materialized to support any hypothesis, and gradually the story faded from public consciousness, filed away as one of those historical mysteries that would never be solved. Elena refilled her wine glass and opened a subfolder labeled Whitmore Family Documents. Here were scanned letters, mostly correspondence between Edmund Whitmore and various business associates. The man had been enormously wealthy. His fortune built on cotton and the labor of enslaved people who worked his 3 plantations. She skimmed through financial records, shipping manifests, legal documents. Then she found the personal letters. One in particular caught her attention. It was from Edmund to his brother Thomas, dated January 1847, several months before the portrait was painted. "Brother, I fear I have lost control of my daughters. They have been attending meetings of that abolitionist rabble, filling their heads with dangerous notions. Anne, especially, has become outspoken on matters that are not the concern of women. I have forbidden them from such activities, but I suspect they defy me in secret. Their mother's death last year left them without proper guidance, and I have been too occupied with business to supervise their education as I should have. I am considering sending them to an aunt in Philadelphia, where they might learn proper deportment." Elena sat back, her mind racing. Abolitionist meetings. The 7 sisters had been involved in the anti-slavery movement in a city where such views were not just unpopular, but dangerous. In 1847, Savannah, the cotton economy depended entirely on enslaved labor. Anyone advocating for abolition was advocating for the destruction of the entire social and economic order. She found another letter, this one from Anne Whitmore to an unknown correspondent, dated March 1847. "We have found our purpose at last. To remain silent in the face of such evil is to be complicit in it. Father thinks us occupied with needlework and music, but we meet in the old carriage house 3 evenings a week. There are 23 of us now, both free and enslaved, men and women together. We are documenting the true conditions of the plantations, the beatings and families torn apart. When we have gathered sufficient evidence, we will send it north to the newspapers there. The truth must be told, whatever the cost. Whatever the cost. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The sisters had been gathering evidence against slavery, presumably including evidence against their own father's practices. They had been meeting with enslaved people, creating a network of informants. In 1847, Savannah, such activities could get you killed. She opened the subfolder about Marcus Webb, the painter. There was surprisingly little information. He had arrived in Savannah in February 1847, set up a studio on Broughton Street, and advertised his services painting portraits of wealthy families. The few surviving examples of his work showed competent but unremarkable technique. Nothing to suggest why the Whitmore portrait would be any different, except for one detail in a letter from the boarding house owner to the police. Mr. Webb kept odd hours in the weeks before his disappearance. He would leave before dawn and return well past midnight, often with his clothes dirty and his boots muddy. When I inquired about his nocturnal activities, he said he was studying the quality of moonlight for his paintings, but I observed no moonlight studies among his works. Elena closed her laptop, her wine forgotten. The pieces were starting to form a picture, though the full image remained obscure. 7 sisters involved in abolitionist activities, a painter who kept strange hours and then vanished. All of them disappearing within months of each other in the autumn of 1847. She walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the quiet street below. Savannah after midnight was beautiful in a haunting way, gas-style lanterns creating pools of amber light, the old buildings standing like silent sentinels. How many of those buildings had stood in 1847? How many had witnessed whatever had happened to the Whitmore sisters? Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, Elena dreamed of 7 young women walking through dark streets, their mouths moving but no sound emerging, their eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. When she woke at dawn, her sheets were damp with sweat despite the air conditioning, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the sisters were trying to tell her something. Elena arrived at the conservation lab at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before anyone else was scheduled to appear. She wanted time alone with the portrait before beginning the technical analysis, time to simply look at it without the pressure of Sarah's expectations or her own professional obligations. The back room was exactly as she had left it, the 7 sisters waiting patiently under their LED lights. Elena set down her coffee and pulled up a stool, positioning herself directly in front of the canvas. She had learned over years of restoration work that sometimes the most important insights came not from scientific instruments, but from patient observation, from allowing yourself to really see what the artist had created. She started with the composition. The 7 sisters were arranged in 2 rows, 4 seated in front and 3 standing behind. The oldest, Anne, stood in the center of the back row, her hand resting on the shoulder of the youngest, Mary, who sat directly in front of her. The positioning created a sense of protection, of unity. These were not 7 individuals who happened to be sisters. This was a collective, a unified group with shared purpose. The lighting in the painting came from the left, casting the right sides of the faces in partial shadow. Traditional portrait lighting. But as Elena studied the shadows, she noticed something odd. The shadow cast by Anne's hand on Mary's shoulder was too sharp, too defined, as if there had been a much brighter light source than the diffuse illumination suggested by the overall composition. She made a note to examine that area more closely with infrared imaging. The clothing was expensive, but not ostentatious. Dark silk dresses with white cotton collars and cuffs, typical of the period's fashion for unmarried women. But again, something seemed off. Elena pulled out her laptop and opened reference images of 1840s fashion. The collars on the Whitmore sisters' dresses were higher than was typical, covering their necks entirely, and the sleeves were long, despite this being a spring portrait. As if they were deliberately covering as much skin as possible, she zoomed in on the faces, studying each sister individually. Anne, the eldest at 24, had a strong nose and determined jaw. Her eyes stared directly out of the canvas with an intensity that was unusual for the period's formal portraits. Women were typically painted with downcast or modestly averted eyes. Anne looked like she was challenging the viewer. Moving to the next sister, 22-year-old Rebecca, Elena noticed the same directness of gaze. And the next. And the next. All 7 sisters looked straight ahead, meeting the viewer's eyes with expressions that were neither submissive nor coy. They looked like women who had something to say and were determined to be heard. Eleanor pulled out her phone and photographed each face, then uploaded the images to her laptop. She opened them in photo editing software and began enhancing the details, pushing the contrast and saturation to bring out features that were obscured by age and varnish. That's when she saw it. In the enlarged image of Anne's face, barely visible beneath layers of discolored varnish, there was something wrong with her left eye. A small irregularity in the iris, a darkness that didn't match the right eye. Elena enhanced the image further, and her breath caught. It wasn't a darkness in the iris, it was a reflection, a tiny, perfect reflection of something Anne had been looking at while sitting for the portrait. Elena zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow, her heart racing. The reflection showed a figure, impossibly small but undeniably human, a person standing behind the artist, watching. She quickly checked the other sister's eyes. Each one, when enhanced, showed the same phenomenon. Tiny reflected figures in the left iris of each sister, slightly different positions, but clearly the same event. The painter had captured not just the sisters themselves, but what they were seeing, what was happening in the room during the sitting. This level of detail was extraordinary, almost impossible given the era's painting techniques and materials. Marcus Webb had been far more skilled than his reputation suggested, or he had taken extraordinary care with this particular portrait. But why? And who were the reflected figures? Elena heard footsteps in the main lab and quickly saved her work. Sarah appeared in the doorway a moment later, looking like she hadn't slept well. "You're here early," Sarah said. "Couldn't stay away." "I found something interesting." Elena showed her the enhanced images on her laptop. "Look at the eyes. There are reflected images, almost microscopic. I need better equipment to be certain, but I think Webb painted what the sisters were looking at during the sitting." Sarah leaned in, squinting at the screen. "Can you enhance it further?" "Not with this resolution. I'll need to do high-resolution photography of the original. Then we can use the museum's imaging software." Elena paused. "Sarah, in your research on Webb, did you find anything suggesting he had abolitionist sympathies?" "Actually, yes. It was buried in a letter from a Philadelphia gallery owner who had exhibited some of Webb's work before he came south. The gallery owner mentioned that Webb was sympathetic to the cause, but needed to make a living, and portrait painting paid better than political cartoons." Sarah's eyes widened. "You think the portrait is political?" "I think 7 abolitionist sisters commissioning a portrait from a sympathetic painter might have had motives beyond simple vanity." Elena gestured at the canvas. This was painted in the spring of 1847, right around the time Anne's letter said they were gathering evidence about plantation conditions. What if they used the portrait sitting as cover for meetings? The reflected figures in their eyes would be evidence of who else was in the room. Sarah breathed. "That's brilliant. and incredibly dangerous if anyone had noticed. Which is probably why Webb disappeared, Elena finished. He knew too much. He had painted evidence of their conspiracy right into their portrait. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of history pressing down on them. 7 young women and 1 artist, all missing without a trace. All connected by a portrait that was simultaneously a family memorial and a piece of evidence in a crime that may have involved some of Savannah's most powerful men. "We need to document everything," Sarah said. "Every technical analysis, every discovery. If there's truth hidden in this painting, we need to preserve it properly." Over the next 3 days, Elena worked methodically through her analysis. She started with ultraviolet photography, which revealed previous restoration attempts and areas of overpaint. Someone, probably in the early 1900s, had touched up sections of the background, making the dark wallpaper behind the sisters even darker. Why would anyone want to obscure the background? X-ray fluorescence showed the chemical composition of the pigments, confirming that the painting dated to the correct period. But it also revealed something unexpected. There were traces of white lead in patterns that didn't match the visible composition. Elena created a false color image based on the XRF data, and what emerged made her call Sarah immediately. "Look at this," Elena said, and pointing at her monitor. The false color image showed white patches scattered across the painting, concentrated mainly in the background behind the sisters. These are areas of white lead paint that were later covered with darker pigments. Webb painted something in white, then painted over it with brown and black. Can you see what was underneath? Not with XRF alone, but infrared reflectography should help. White lead is relatively transparent to infrared. The infrared imaging took another full day to complete, requiring careful positioning of the specialized camera at multiple points across the canvas. Elena worked in near darkness, the only light coming from the infrared illuminators flanking the painting. When she finally compiled all the individual images into a complete infrared reflectogram, what she saw made her hands shake. Words. The background was full of words, written in white paint and then covered over with dark varnish and overpaint. They were crude, written quickly, not meant to be decorative. Elena started transcribing what she could make out, her handwriting becoming less steady with each line. "We bear witness to the evil perpetrated in this city, families torn asunder, children sold from mothers' arms, men and women beaten unto death for the crime of seeking freedom. We document these atrocities that the world may know the truth of Southern prosperity. Our fathers' wealth is built upon the broken backs of our brothers and sisters in bondage. We will be silent no more." The text continued, covering nearly every inch of the background, names of enslaved people, dates of beatings and sales, locations of secret meetings. It was exactly what Anne's letter had described, evidence documented and preserved in plain sight, hidden beneath the genteel surface of a family portrait. "My God," Sarah whispered when Elena showed her. "It's all here, everything they were investigating. Webb must have helped them paint it into the background before doing the actual portrait on top." "Which means anyone who knew about the abolition meetings would have wanted this portrait destroyed," Elena said. "But instead, it was hidden away. Why?" Sarah pulled out her folder of documents. "I found something yesterday that might be relevant. A diary entry from Constance Whitmore Ayres, the great-granddaughter who wrote the letter we found. She was only 7 in 1920 when she hid the letter in the frame, but she recorded her grandmother's deathbed confession. She read aloud, "Grandmother told me that her father, my great-great-grandfather Edmund, had been complicit in the disappearances of the 7 sisters, that they had threatened to expose not just his own plantation practices, but those of a dozen other prominent families, that he had conspired with other powerful men to make the girls vanish. He had the portrait hidden in the attic, unable to destroy it entirely because it was the only image he had of his daughters, but terrified of what it might reveal. He died a broken man, she said, haunted by what he had done. Eleanor felt sick. Their own father was involved in their disappearances. In a way, it makes horrible sense. Honor killings weren't uncommon in that era, though they weren't called that. A father's authority over his daughters was absolute if they were threatening his reputation, his fortune, his entire way of life. Sarah's voice trailed off. They sat in silence, the portrait looming above them like an accusation. 7 faces stared out from their prison of paint and varnish, testimony frozen in oil and pigment. Elena thought about her own daughter, safe in college in Boston, free to speak her mind and live her life on her own terms. The Whitmore sisters had wanted that same freedom and had paid the ultimate price. "We need to publish this," Elena said. "All of it. The hidden text, the evidence they documented, the truth about what happened to them. The evidence they documented is circumstantial. We have their words, but no bodies. No proof of murder, and it's been almost 200 years. Everyone involved is long dead. But their story isn't dead. It's right here." Eleanor gestured at the portrait. 7 women who dared to speak against injustice and were silenced for it. That story matters. It matters now more than ever. Sarah nodded slowly. "I'll talk to the museum director. We'll need permission to go public with this, and it's going to be controversial. Some of Savannah's oldest families are descended from the men who would have been implicated in the sisters' disappearances. Let them be uncomfortable." The Whitmore sisters were more than uncomfortable. They were killed. "We don't know that for certain." "Yes, we do." Eleanor pointed at the portrait. "Look at their faces. Really look. They knew they were in danger when this was painted. They knew this might be the last record of their existence. That's why they documented everything in the background. That's why they stared directly at us. They were making sure they would be seen, would be heard, even if only centuries later." Sarah studied the 7 faces, and Elena saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "You're right, this is their testimony, their last words. And we're going to make sure those words are finally heard." That night, Elena worked late, carefully documenting every word that could be recovered from the background text. Some sections were too degraded to read, obscured by time and the crude overpainting. But what remained was damning. The Whitmore sisters had documented the sale of a 6-year-old child from his mother, the beating death of an enslaved man named Joshua who had tried to run away, the rape of women in the quarters by overseers and visiting merchants. Every crime was dated, located, witnessed, and at the bottom, barely visible even with infrared, was a list of names. 15 men, including Edmund Whitmore. The conspiracy, Elena realized. The men who had something to lose if this information became public. The men who would have wanted the 7 sisters silenced. She photographed everything, backed up all her data to 3 separate drives, and sent copies to her own email account. Professional paranoia, perhaps. But the Whitmore sisters had learned the hard way that powerful men would go to great lengths to protect their secrets. As she was preparing to leave, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Don't come to the lab tomorrow. I need to meet with the museum board first. We'll call you tomorrow afternoon." Elena typed a reply, but then deleted it. Something felt wrong. She called Sarah's number instead, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. She checked the time. 11:30 p.m. Late, but not unreasonably so. Sarah had said she was working on the presentation for the board. Why would her phone be off? Elena grabbed her laptop and headed for the door, then stopped. The back room felt different suddenly, the air heavier. She turned back to look at the portrait one more time, and in the harsh LED lighting, the seven sisters seemed to be looking directly at her. Not just in the general direction of the viewer, but specifically at her, their eyes following her movement. "It's just the angle," she told herself. "The painting is flat. It can't actually watch you." But her skin prickled nonetheless, and she found herself hurrying out of the building, double-checking that the door locked behind her. The drive home took her past Sarah's apartment on Habersham Street. The lights were off, and Sarah's car wasn't in its designated parking spot. Elena tried calling again. Voicemail. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, watching the dark windows, trying to convince herself that Sarah was fine, that she was probably just at a late dinner or had gone to bed early, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Elena didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning through possibilities. Sarah had been excited about the discovery, eager to share it with the world. Why would she suddenly want Elena to stay away from the lab, unless someone had convinced her that going public would be a bad idea, or threatened her, or worse? At 6 a.m., Elena gave up on sleep and called the museum's main line. The night security guard answered, sounding bored and half asleep. "Hi, this is Dr. Elena Morrison. I'm working on the restoration project in the conservation lab. Did Sarah Chen happen to come in last night? Let me check the logs." The sound of papers shuffling. "No, ma'am, last entry for the lab was you leaving at 11:42 p.m. No one's been in since." "And Sarah hasn't called in this morning?" "Not that I know of, but the daytime staff don't arrive until 8. You want me to leave her a message?" "No, that's fine, thank you." Elena hung up and immediately dialed Sarah's number again. Still voicemail. She tried Sarah's office at the museum. No answer. She even tried Sarah's emergency contact, a sister in Atlanta, who said she hadn't spoken to Sarah in over a week. At 8 a.m., Elena called the museum director's office and was told that Dr. Chen had requested a personal day and would be back tomorrow. When Elena asked who had taken the message, the secretary said it had been an email sent at 6 a.m. that morning. "Can you forward me that email?" Elena asked. "I'm sorry, but internal communications aren't shared with external contractors." "I'm not asking for internal communications. Sarah Chen is my colleague on this project, and I need to verify something with her. Just forward the email." "I'll have to check with Dr. Chen first." "Great, you do that, and call me back when you reach her because I've been trying all morning and can't get through." Elena hung up and paced her apartment. An email at 6 a.m. requesting a personal day. Sarah's phone off, her car missing. It could all be perfectly innocent. Sarah could have decided to drive to Atlanta to visit her sister, could have forgotten to charge her phone, could have genuinely needed a day off, or someone could have forced her to send that email. Elena grabbed her keys and drove to the museum, parking in the visitor lot instead of the staff area. She walked around to the conservation lab entrance, swiped her access card, and was unsurprised when it didn't work. Her access had been revoked. She stood there for a moment, weighing her options. Breaking in would be illegal and would certainly cost her the job. But if Sarah was in danger, waiting could be fatal. She thought about the 7 Whitmore sisters, disappearing one by one while everyone around them did nothing, too afraid or too complicit to intervene. Elena pulled out her phone and called the Savannah Police Department. The officer who took her statement was polite, but clearly skeptical. A woman taking a personal day and not answering her phone wasn't exactly grounds for a missing person report, especially not after less than 12 hours. But Elena persisted, explaining the nature of the project, the historical disappearances, the potential controversy of their findings. "So you think someone might have wanted to stop your friend from going public with this information about a 170-year-old crime?" the officer asked. "I think it's a possibility worth investigating." "Ma'am, with all due respect, Everyone involved in those disappearances has been dead for over a century. I understand you're concerned about your colleague, but she's an adult who took a personal day. If she doesn't show up for work tomorrow and still isn't answering her phone, call us back and we'll file a formal report." Elena thanked him and hung up. She sat in her car, staring at the conservation lab building, trying to decide what to do next. Every instinct screamed that Sarah was in trouble, but she had no evidence, no proof of anything except her own paranoia. Her phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Dr. Morrison?" A male voice, educated, southern accent. "My name is William Ashford. I'm an attorney here in Savannah. I represent several prominent families with historical connections to the Telfair museums. I understand you've been working on the restoration of a certain portrait." Elena's grip tightened on the phone. "Who gave you my number? That's not important. What is important is that you understand the sensitive nature of the materials you've been examining. Some of the claims made in the hidden text of that portrait are libelous to the reputations of respected Savannah families. Libel requires falsehood. I have no reason to believe the Whitmore sisters were lying. You have no reason to believe they were telling the truth either. They were young women with radical ideas, likely influenced by outside agitators. Their so-called documentation is uncorroborated hearsay at best. And 7 disappearances in 6 weeks is what? Coincidence?" There was a pause. "Dr. Morrison, I'm trying to help you understand the situation. The museum's board has decided that the portrait should be returned to storage after minimal conservation work. The hidden text will not be revealed or publicized. You'll be compensated generously for your time, of course, and we hope you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your findings. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid your restoration contract will be terminated, and you'll find it very difficult to work with any museum in the Southeast in the future. Your reputation as a conservator depends on discretion, Dr. Morrison. I'd hate to see that reputation damaged over a misguided sense of historical justice." Eleanor felt rage building in her chest, hot and bright. "Where is Sarah Chen?" "Doctor, Chen is taking a personal day. I believe she realized that pursuing this matter further would be career suicide. I suggest you reach the same conclusion." He paused. "Good day, Dr. Morrison. I hope we don't need to speak again." The line went dead. Elena sat perfectly still, her mind racing. William Ashford. She opened her laptop and searched for him. There were dozens of results. Ashford was a senior partner at one of Savannah's oldest law firms, specializing in estate law and property disputes. His client list read like a who's who of old money Savannah families. And tucked away in his biographical information was a telling detail. He was a direct descendant of James Ashford, one of the 15 names on the Whitmore sisters list. This wasn't about protecting the reputation of long-dead men. This was about protecting inheritances, property claims, social standing that was still rooted in the wealth accumulated through slavery. If the Whitmore sisters' documentation became public, if they were vindicated as credible witnesses rather than dismissed as radical girls, it could open up legal and historical questions that powerful families had spent generations trying to bury. Elena copied all her research files to a flash drive and put it in her purse. Then she called the only person she could think of who might be able to help, a journalist friend in Atlanta who specialized in investigative pieces about Southern history and racial justice. Jennifer Haynes answered on the second ring. "Elena, it's been ages. How's Savannah treating you?" "Jen, I need your help, and it might be dangerous." She spent the next 20 minutes explaining the entire situation, the portrait, the hidden text, the disappearances, Sarah's silence, the threatening phone call. Jennifer listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or surprise. "This is huge," Jennifer said when Elena finished. "Like Pulitzer huge." You need to get those files to me immediately, and you need to get out of Savannah. I can't leave until I know Sarah is safe. Elena, listen to me. 7 women vanished in 1847 because they threatened powerful interests. You're doing the exact same thing. You need to protect yourself first. I'll be careful, but I'm sending you everything tonight. If something happens to me, promise you'll publish it all. Nothing's going to happen to you. But yes, I promise. Send the files encrypted, and for God's sake, watch your back. Elena spent the rest of the day copying, encrypting, and uploading her documentation to secure servers. She sent copies to Jennifer, to her lawyer, to 2 different cloud storage services. She created a dead man's switch, an automated email that would send all the files to multiple news organizations if she didn't log in to cancel it every 24 hours. As evening approached, she made a decision. She was going back to the conservation lab. Access card or no access card. The portrait held answers, and she wasn't going to let it be buried again. The museum complex was quiet at 8 p.m. Eleanor parked 2 blocks away and approached the conservation lab from the back, where a service entrance was usually unlocked during evening hours for the cleaning crew. The door opened easily, and she slipped inside, moving through the darkened main lab toward the back room. The portrait was gone. The easel stood empty, the LED lights still positioned around it like attendants waiting for a patient who would never return. Elena's heart hammered in her chest. They had moved it, hidden it again, just like Edmund Whitmore had done in 1847. She heard a sound behind her and spun around. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light from the emergency exit signs. "Elena, you need to leave, right now." "Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day. Where have you been?" "It doesn't matter. They're moving the portrait to a private collection. The project is over. You need to forget everything you found and go back to Boston." Eleanor moved closer, studying her friend's face. "What did they threaten you with?" "Nothing. I just realized this was a mistake. We don't have the right to expose these families based on unverified claims from 2 centuries ago." "That's bullshit, and you know it. What did they say to you?" Sarah's composure cracked. "They know about my sister's immigration status. They know she's been working on an expired visa for the past 2 years. They said if I pursue this, they'll report her to ICE. She has 2 kids, Eleanor, American citizens. If she gets deported, those children lose their mother." Jesus Christ. "So yes, I'm backing down. And you should too. Some battles aren't worth fighting." The Whitmore sisters thought differently. "And they all died." Sarah's voice cracked. 7 brilliant young women who could have done so much good in the world, and they're just gone, erased. I won't let that happen to my nieces. I can't." Elena understood. She had a daughter herself. There were lines she wouldn't cross, prices she wouldn't pay. But she also thought about those 7 faces staring out from their portrait prison, demanding to be seen, to be heard. "I already sent everything to a journalist," Elena said quietly. "All the documentation, all the analysis. Even if they hide the portrait, the truth is going to come out." Sarah closed her eyes. "Then you'd better leave Savannah tonight. Because when they find out what you've done, they're not going to just threaten you. These people have been protecting their secrets for 7 generations. They won't let you destroy everything they've built." "Where did they take the portrait?" "I don't know. A private storage facility somewhere. I wasn't told the location." Sarah opened her eyes, and they were wet with tears. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I'm so sorry. But I have to protect my family." "I know. I understand." They stood in silence for a moment. 2 women caught in the ripples of crimes committed long before they were born, facing impossible choices in the shadow of history. "There's something else," Sarah said. "Something I found yesterday, after I sent you that text. I've been researching Marcus Webb's movements in the weeks before his disappearance. He made several trips to the Whitmore plantation, supposedly to study the light for the portrait background, but I found a letter in the archives that suggests he was actually helping enslaved people escape via the Underground Railroad. Elena felt the pieces clicking into place. So he was more than just sympathetic, he was actively involved. Yes, and the 7 sisters were hiding escapees in their carriage house before helping them move north. That's what the meetings were about. They weren't just documenting abuses, they were actively undermining the entire system. Which means they weren't just threats to reputations, they were threats to property, to wealth. Every person they helped escape represented hundreds or thousands of dollars in lost value to the plantation owners. Exactly. When their father and his co-conspirators made them disappear, it wasn't just about honor or reputation. It was about money. It was always about money. Eleanor thought about William Ashford's phone call, his concern for respected families. Nothing had changed in 170 years. The same families still controlled the same wealth, still protected the same secrets, still valued their financial and social standing above truth and justice. "I'm leaving tonight," Elena said, "but I want you to know that I don't blame you for choosing your family. The sisters would understand that too. They were trying to protect families when they helped people escape." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face now. Their father buried them in unmarked graves somewhere on the plantation. That land is now a subdivision called Whitmore Estates. 200 homes built right on top of the sisters' graves. No one knows which plots they're under. Even if we found them, we couldn't excavate without tearing down someone's house. So they're still buried, still silenced. Physically, yes, but you're making sure their voices are heard. That has to count for something. Elena hugged her friend goodbye and left the conservation lab for the last time. She drove back to her apartment, packed quickly, and was on the road north by midnight. As she crossed the city limits, she looked back in her rearview mirror at Savannah's skyline, the old church spires and historic buildings silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere beneath that beautiful, terrible city, 7 women lay in forgotten graves. But their testament lived on, hidden in plain sight in a portrait that powerful men thought they could control. Elena kept driving, heading toward Atlanta and Jennifer's office. The dead man's switch was set, the files were distributed, the truth was like water now, seeping through every crack in the wall of silence that had been built around the Whitmore sisters. They couldn't be stopped anymore. Neither could she. 3 weeks later, Jennifer's article broke simultaneously in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. The Silent Sisters, how 7 abolitionists were erased from history and why the truth was hidden for 177 years. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the story had gone viral on social media. Historians weighed in, authentication experts confirmed Elena's findings, civil rights organizations demanded further investigation. The portrait became the center of a national conversation about historical memory, institutional complicity, and the silencing of women's voices. In Savannah, the reaction was more complex. Some residents were appalled, demanding accountability from the families descended from the co-conspirators. Others insisted the whole thing was a hoax or an attack on Southern heritage. The museum found itself under siege from both sides, protesters gathering daily outside its doors. Elena watched from her apartment in Boston, where she had decided to stay rather than return to Savannah. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, death threats, and job offers from museums that appreciated her commitment to historical truth. She declined most interviews, accepted none of the threats seriously, and carefully considered the job offers. Sarah had disappeared from social media entirely, but sent Elena a brief email. "My sister is safe. Thank you. I'm leaving museum work for a while, maybe permanently. But I don't regret what we found. I just regret we couldn't do more." The legal battles started almost immediately. Descendants of the 15 men named in the portrait's hidden text filed defamation suits, attempting to have the portrait seized and destroyed as libelous material. But the evidence was too strong, corroborated by too many independent sources. Historians had begun digging through archives across the South, finding references to the Whitmore sisters' abolitionist activities in letters and diaries that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored for generations. More importantly, other portraits began to surface. Marcus Webb, it turned out, had painted similar hidden messages into at least 3 other works before his disappearance. All of them documented abuses, named names, provided evidence that had been buried for nearly 2 centuries. Webb had created an entire underground archive of testimony, using his access to wealthy homes and his skill with paint and pigment to preserve the truth in places no one would think to look. A team of investigators began searching for Webb's remains and those of the 7 sisters. They focused on the old Whitmore plantation, now the Whitmore Estates subdivision. Using ground-penetrating radar and historical maps, they identified 8 anomalies in the soil that could be grave sites. But as Sarah had predicted, all 8 were underneath homes currently occupied by families who had no interest in allowing their properties to be excavated. Elena followed the investigation closely, feeling a growing frustration that the sisters might remain buried, their remains unmarked and unmourned. Then she received an unexpected email from an anonymous account. "Dr. Morrison, I am an 8th-generation descendant of one of the men named in the Whitmore portrait. I cannot use my real name for obvious reasons, but I wanted you to know that not all of us are fighting the truth. My family has known for generations what happened to those 7 women. We have letters, diaries, even a deathbed confession from one of the conspirators. I am prepared to turn these documents over to investigators, but I need protection from the rest of my family first. They will disinherit me if they know I was the one who provided this information. Can you help?" Elena forwarded the email to Jennifer and to a lawyer specializing in whistleblower protections. Within a week, the anonymous descendant was working with federal investigators, providing documentation that filled in the missing pieces of the story. The 7 Whitmore sisters had indeed been murdered, killed over a period of 6 weeks in the autumn of 1847. Each had been abducted, interrogated about the extent of their network and the location of their evidence, and then killed when they refused to talk. Their bodies had been buried in a mass grave on the plantation, in an area that was now directly beneath a house at 247 Whitmore Estates Drive. Marcus Webb had witnessed the abduction of the youngest sister, Mary. He had gone to the authorities, but was told to keep quiet if he valued his life. Instead, he had continued helping enslaved people escape until the conspirators finally caught up with him. His body had been weighted with stones and thrown into the Savannah River. It would never be recovered. The current owners of 247 Whitmore Estates Drive were understandably horrified to learn their home was built on top of a mass grave. After extensive negotiations involving the city, the museum, and several historical preservation organizations, an agreement was reached. The house would be purchased, demolished, and the site would be excavated and turned into a memorial park honoring the 7 sisters. The excavation took 3 months and was conducted with painstaking care. Elena watched via livestream as archaeologists carefully removed earth, documented everything, treated the site with the reverence it deserved. When they finally reached the graves, they found 7 skeletons buried side by side, still wearing the remnants of the dresses they had been murdered in. The forensic analysis confirmed what the documents had suggested. All 7 had died violently. 3 showed evidence of skull fractures. 2 had been strangled, the hyoid bones in their necks fractured. 2 had been shot. The youngest, Mary, had been only 12 years old when she died. Elena flew to Savannah for the reburial. The 7 sisters were laid to rest together in Laurel Grove Cemetery in a plot donated by the city. Their graves were marked with a single monument, a tall granite obelisk with their names and dates inscribed, and below that, a quote from Anne Whitmore's letter, "We will be silent no more." Thousands attended the funeral service. Descendants of enslaved people who had been helped by the Sisters' Underground Railroad network, historians and journalists, local residents who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the missing Whitmore girls. Sarah was there too, standing at the back of the crowd, and when she caught Elena's eye, they shared a nod of understanding. The portrait itself became the centerpiece of a new permanent exhibition at the Telfair Museums, fully restored and displayed with complete documentation of the hidden text and the sisters' story. Visitors could examine high-resolution images showing every word of the testimony the sisters had painted into their portrait, every name they had named, every crime they had documented. The 15 families named in the portrait fought the exhibition in court for months, but public opinion was overwhelmingly against them. The museum attendance tripled in the first year after the exhibition opened, with people traveling from across the country to see the portrait and learn the sisters' story. William Ashford, the attorney who had threatened Elena, was disbarred after it came to light that he had been involved in illegal surveillance and intimidation tactics, not just against Elena and Sarah, but against several other researchers and journalists over the years. His family's reputation, which he had worked so hard to protect, was destroyed far more thoroughly than any historical revelation could have managed. Elena eventually accepted a position as chief conservator at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., where she specialized in using modern imaging techniques to recover hidden content in historical artworks. She found 3 more Marcus Webb paintings with hidden abolitionist messages and discovered that the practice had been more common than anyone had realized. Dozens of antebellum portraits contained hidden testimony, evidence that had been literally painted over, but never truly erased. She kept a photograph of the 7 Whitmore sisters on her desk, a reminder of why her work mattered. 7 young women who had refused to be silent, who had documented atrocities at enormous personal risk, who had paid the ultimate price for their courage. Their story had been buried for 177 years, but it had never really been gone. It had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, ready to be revealed when someone was brave enough to look beyond the surface and see the truth beneath. Late one evening, as Elena was preparing to leave her office, her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, remembering the last time she had answered an unknown call, but something made her pick up. Dr. Morrison. A young woman's voice, uncertain. My name is Lily Whitmore Chen. I'm Sarah Chen's niece, and I'm also a descendant of the Whitmore sisters through a different branch of the family. I just wanted to thank you for what you did. My great-great-great-great-great-Aunt Anne has always been a legend in my family, but we were never allowed to talk about her publicly. Now I can. Now everyone knows what they did. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. I just helped them tell their own story. They did all the hard work 177 years ago. Still, thank you. And I wanted you to know, I'm starting college next month. I'm going to study art conservation like you. Someone needs to keep looking for the hidden stories, right? Right, Elena said. Someone needs to keep looking. After they hung up, Eleanor sat alone in her office, looking at the photograph of the 7 sisters. In the enhanced image, you could see the reflected figures in their eyes clearly now. The people who'd been in the room during that fateful portrait sitting. Escaped slaves they had helped, fellow abolitionists, Marcus Webb himself, visible in Anne's left iris as a tiny figure holding a paintbrush. They had known what they were doing. They had known they might die for it, but they had documented everything anyway, trusting that someday someone would care enough to look beneath the surface and see the truth they had preserved. Elena thought about freedom, real freedom, the kind that lets you speak truth to power even when you know the cost will be high. The Whitmore sisters had understood that kind of freedom. They had paid for it with their lives, but they had also ensured that their testimony would outlive their murderers, would outlast the system of slavery they had fought against, would still be speaking truth 177 years after their deaths. That was the message hidden in their portrait, more powerful than any of the specific crimes they had documented. That truth cannot be permanently buried, that voices cannot be silenced forever, that courage and conviction will eventually break through even the strongest walls of silence and complicity. The 7 sisters had been erased from history, their bodies hidden in unmarked graves, their story deliberately forgotten. But they had left a testament in paint and pigment, a message encrypted in their own portrait, waiting for the right moment and the right person to reveal it. Elena turned off her office lights and headed home through the warm Washington evening. Somewhere in Savannah, 7 sisters lay at rest in honored graves, their names finally restored, their story finally told. And somewhere in America, another young woman was deciding to study art conservation, inspired by the idea that hidden truths are worth seeking, that buried stories are worth telling, that the silenced deserve to be heard. The portrait hung in its museum gallery, its 7 subjects staring out at visitors with those direct, challenging gazes. "We will be silent no more," they seemed to say. And now, finally, they weren't. The research continued. Every week brought new discoveries, new documents, new evidence. The network the sisters had built helped hundreds of people escape to freedom. Universities began offering courses on the Whitmore sisters. Their story became part of American history curricula, taught alongside better-known abolitionists like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And in quiet moments, when the museum was closed and the portrait hung in darkness, it was as if the 7 sisters could finally rest. Their silence had been broken. Their message had been delivered. Their voices, trapped in oil and canvas for nearly 2 centuries, had finally been set free. Elena sometimes wondered what they would think of the world they had helped create. It wasn't the world they had fought for exactly. Injustice persisted, taking new forms. But it was a world where their story could be told without fear, where their courage was celebrated rather than erased. The portrait's final conservation was complete, but in many ways, the restoration was ongoing. Each visitor who stopped to read the hidden text was continuing the work the sisters had started. Each person who learned their story and refused to forget it was keeping their testimony alive. Each new generation that drew inspiration from their courage was ensuring that the 7 sisters of Savannah would never be silenced again. In the end, that was the truest form of freedom, not just the right to speak, but the certainty that your words will be heard, that your truth will endure, that your voice will echo down through the years, long after you're gone. The Whitmore sisters had achieved that freedom, purchased with their lives and preserved in paint, and now their message resonated across centuries, as clear and urgent as the day they had hidden it in their portrait. "We will be silent no more." 300 words that had changed everything, revealing not just a historical crime, but an ongoing struggle, not just a buried truth, but a living legacy. The 7 sisters had spoken, and the world was finally listening.